go. All right. Hey, peace and love, family. Peace and love. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Tudor Parfitt. Not going to be the greatest interview under very sad circumstances, but Dr. Parfitt, I appreciate you still coming on and taking up the time, even with your personal issues. I want to say that my second favorite scholar of all time, Art Ehrman, is number one. Unfortunately, you're number two. But you relate to me as an individual in the African American community, although I was born and raised in Jamaica. You deal with a lot with the lost tribes. I'm sorry I got to be so succinct, family, but we got to get to the point because Dr. Parfitt cannot stay long today. Peace and love, Dr. Parfitt. Can you just introduce yourself so we could just get this going? Dr. Parfitt?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. I was saying you could just go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience.
Okay. Well, very, very nice to meet you all. My name is Tudor Parfitt, and I'm currently a professor at FIU, Florida International University in Miami. And prior to that, I was professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London for many years. I've written some 31 or 2 books. And for quite a number of years, I've been dealing with the issues which I believe were of interest to you about the lost tribes, and more recently, issues to do with color and Judaism, Black Jews, Jews in Africa, and so on, to which I have contributed quite a lot academically, and I think also in the wider realm. And my latest book, which just came out a few weeks ago, is this. It's published by Oxford University Press, and it's called Hybrid Hate, Conflations of Anti-Semitism and Anti-Black Racism from the Renaissance to the Third Reich.
All right. I actually have it on the screen for you. So
that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, by the way, do not watch my channel anymore if you don't purchase this book. I think this book wraps everything up that we needed to make closure on. And I really appreciate this book. It's funny. I was having a debate 3-4 weeks ago or 2 months ago, and stuff in this book would have answered all those questions, and I didn't know about the book. But through Google, I was able to find the book, and I actually have the book. I've read some of it. I haven't read all of it. And I will touch on it. I'm going to leave it up for a little bit so people could see it. The book is called Hybrid Hate. All right. You have to purchase this book today. If you don't purchase this book, you're missing a key piece to understanding the term Negro, Black, how Black was used in Europe, how it was used in so many different cases. But anyway, enough of me ranting. I wanted to get to another book you have, which I have in my background. The Black Jews in Africa and the Americas. I think this is also a must read for every person that want to talk about the lost tribes. In page 73, you wrote, "No doubt the chief mechanism for African Americans' enchantment with the idea of the lost tribes was the Bible, to which they had been unenthusiastically introduced in the slave farms of the South in the United States. It was the Bible, as mediated initially by white slave owners and preachers, that was the catalyst for the internalization of the Israelite trope." Do you want to talk a little about that, my brother?
Yeah, I think it's clear. So by the 19th century, there were certainly hundreds of thousands of slaves in the first half of the 19th century, before the War of Independence, before the Civil War, and a kind of identification with Israel, or with the idea of Israel, or with Israelites, came through essentially by imagining that there were parallels between the fate and suffering of the Israelites in Egypt and their own suffering in the slave farms of the slave states in the South. And this isn't, of course, the end of the story, but it's an explanation of why it was that the entire community formed a sort of identification with Israel that we can see being acted out until today.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are interested in hybrid hate, I'm going to flash it throughout the broadcast. In the chat, I have one of my moderators who have the Amazon link to actually purchase the book today. All right. You go on to say, at the beginning of the 19th century, as you just said, very few Black Africans in Africa were Christian, and the slaves who arrived in the Americas were rarely Christians. Although some were Muslims, throughout the 19th century, the Black population of the United States was exposed to a greater or lesser extent to Christianity, or at the very least to some biblical stories. This led to a new sacred, metaphorical, and later imagined world being created by Blacks based on the Bible, which was to provide a haven for the racial contempt to which they were universally subjected. So pretty much what you just said is what I just read out of your book. So you really don't have to respond to that. But again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Tudor Parfitt. So moving forward, a lot of folks I grew up with in Jamaica, the Rastafarian movement, which you wrote about also, they claim they are the lost 12 tribes. And I come to America now and I see people saying I'm the lost 12 tribes. I read where you wrote that the lost 12 tribes was a myth. I think in 2012 or 13 you wrote it, and probably a couple of more times. What do you have to say today in 2021? Do you still hold to the same sentiment, or is there an addendum to that in any way, shape, or form?
Let's not be too literal here, Brother Garfield.
Okay.
Right. So my book, The Lost Tribes of Israel, The History of a Myth, was published actually in 2002. Mm-hmm. And in it, I talk about the lost tribes, the history of the lost tribes, etc. And it's true that in some sense, and perhaps in the most obvious historical, the most literal historical sense, there aren't any lost tribes. So what happened, as you know, because you're all, I'm sure, Bible scholars, is that the Northern Kingdom of Israel in the 7th century, before the Common Era, were exiled. In fact, some elements of the Northern Kingdoms were kind of ethnically cleansed and taken to Assyria. And we know from cuneiform tablets in Assyria that for the next 2 or 3 generations, members of these exiled tribes were to be found in Assyria, working, in fact, as soldiers in the Assyrian army. And their names gave the game away. They were all names like Ezekiel, son of Nun, or Israel, son of Jacob, these sorts of clearly Israelite names. And then, after a few generations, you don't see this anymore. So the assumption is that the Israelites who'd been taken to Assyria were, in fact, absorbed into the wider population. The problem was that the prophets had proclaimed that one day the lost tribes would return, and this idea of the lost tribes returning at the end of days was also taken up by Christians and to a much lesser extent in Islam. And so that kept alive the idea that somewhere on the periphery or beyond the periphery of the known world, the lost tribes carried on a separate existence. This was sometimes thought to be in the East, more often to be thought of in Africa. And so really this is the beginning of what is probably the longest living and most powerful myth in the history of the world. That is, if you like, the technical sense of lost tribes. So if somebody says, I'm a member of the lost tribes, let's say Rastafarians in Jamaica, as you've mentioned, or let's say African Americans, or let's say indeed Maori in New Zealand, or various tribes in Africa, let's say the Igbo, let's say the Zulu. They may express, their desire to belong to the people of Israel, or their sense that they do belong to the people of Israel through this myth. But very often it's concealing some historical truth. So let's cut to the chase. The existence of a desire to identify with the people of Israel among African Americans, or between people of African origin living in Central America, is quite regularly articulated through the idea of the lost tribes. This in itself is a myth. And very often it is formed as a result of a kind of metaphorical identification with the people of Israel. However, that's not the only way in which a sense of belonging to the people of Israel might have occurred among slave populations in the 18th and early 19th century. And there's some evidence, not very much, but there is some evidence that slaves had an idea of Judaism through Jewish manifestations in Africa. So an obvious example is Equiano. I'm sure you all know about him.
Yes, sir.
A former slave who mentioned Judaic practices among the Igbo. This is right at the end of the 18th century. It's a very interesting text. And he was talking about Judaism in Nigeria long before anybody had really said very much about the Igbo, which was only to happen over the next few decades. Some of my recent work, if you read the hybrid very attentively, you'll have to go to the footnotes. You will see there's got a lot of evidence produced for Black Jewish communities in different parts of West Africa, which are not sort of based upon a particular reading of tribal history, let's put it like that, but are based on fairly hard historical fact. And this hard historical fact is the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and from Portugal at the end of the 15th century, subsequent to which a lot of Jews settled, first of all, in northwest Africa, places like Senegal, in the islands, which I'm sure you know about, Saint Tomé and Principe.
Yes, sir.
Principally. And then less known along the coast of Guinea, so that in the middle of the 16th century, 1560 to be precise, the Portuguese Archbishop of Goa in India proclaimed that Judaism is a kind of horrible illness which has killed millions of people throughout history, and the result of being Jewish was to be covered in shame, to fail in everything, even among the black Jews of Guinea. So, in other words, the existence of Jews in the western part of Africa was absolutely accepted at the time by the likes of the Portuguese Archbishop of Goa. And then travelers, Mungo Park is a good example, kept coming across Jews or evidence of Jewish settlements in West Africa. And we know from various sources that there were, black Jewish communities practicing mainstream Judaism from the end of the 15th century onwards through the next century and so on. And as far as the black Jews that I talk about in this book, because they are the starting point for a wider digression or a wider consideration of more racial themes, or rather themes to do with the evolution of the race myth, has got to do with Loango. And there we've got very, very hard, relatively recent evidence, because there was a scientific mission to West Africa taken by the Germans in 1870, 1871. And they left behind huge tomes in German which describe, among other things, this black Jewish community, which was still at that time practicing a form of Judaism. So Loango, where these people came from, was one of the main slave exporting kingdoms in West Africa. And therefore, it is entirely likely that some slaves, anyway, I'm not saying it's all slaves, and I certainly don't subscribe to the idea that all African Americans are naturally Israelites and they have replaced the Jews in the Great Dispensation. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that some Jews, both in Central America and in the United States, had every reason to be influenced by the Judaism that we know to have existed in the 18th century when they crossed to the Americas, either from Loango or from points north, certainly Senegal, and further south, possibly Nigeria. We don't know very much about the practice of Judaism in Nigeria at that time, but let's assume that Equiana was not lying.
Mm-hmm. What you said is perfect. It actually sums up a lot of what you've been saying over the years. That I always tell folks this: I don't have a problem with a Jew being any color, black, white, red, yellow, blue, or anyone who practices Judaism. But to put a label on me because I just happen to be a descendant of slaves and say, hey, he's an Israelite. And based on what you just said about the Loango, because the evidence is pointing that the Loango was traders based on the German information. And I think a lot of people in my community now are saying that the Loango Jews were actually slaves and not traders. And that's where there's a little gray area in the conversation. They're saying the Loango Jews were slaves. What do you say to that?
There's absolutely no evidence at all that the Loango Jews, black Jews in Loango, were slaves. Quite the contrary. They had a rather, by the 1870s anyway, they may have been looked down upon by the
indigenous Africans,
but yeah, by the majority population in Loango. But they were prosperous. They were more prosperous than the others. The towns in which they lived were cleaner, and they were sort of better looked after, and they had a certain kind of status. Certainly, they weren't slaves. Absolutely not. And the one slave who spoke about them, and that is in the famous reference, well, it's famous now since I discovered it,
Mhm.
by Oldendorp in 1777, that slave was not himself a Jew. He simply said that in Loango there were Jews, and they did X, Y, and Z. So they didn't speak on the Sabbath. They maintained the Sabbath. They lived separately from the Negroes, as they were called in his text, in German, Negel.
Mhm.
And they had in their graveyards, which were separate, they had images of snakes and lizards, which is fairly unusual, and there was some speculation. Whether the speculation is correct or not, I don't know, but I don't think it probably is, but you never know. It could be that the squiggles that were described by the slave when he was talking to the missionary actually referred to the squiggles of a cursive Hebrew script. If you know Hebrew, you could imagine that, the long tail of a kuf, for instance,
Mhm.
might represent something like a lizard or a snake. But I take what you say. I mean, I think the kind of wider sense in which I would understand the articulation of this identification with Israelites as a black believing person in the United States follows a kind of metaphorical identification. After all, in Christianity, as you know, Christians are the new Israel. It's not that African Americans are the first to come to the idea of being Israelites. The whole of Christendom, in that sense, is Israelite. Some people take it more literally than others. And it's very interesting, I think, that, in Africa, I think there's a kind of distaste with a growing distaste with Christianity, because Christianity is perceived as the religion of colonialism, imperialism, and so on.
Mhm.
And it was introduced by missionaries who, that, true or not, had their own agendas. So the development of African Christianity, in a way, has been a kind of counterculture sort of development. And part of this counterculture is to say, in a way, to the colonists, listen, you white guys, we've got some news for you, which is that we actually are related to the main actors in this sacred history that you have brought for us, but you don't belong to it. And anyway, that was the first step, if you like, in the development of a certain kind of Christianity, which is merging into Judaism in the African continent. And at the same time, Islam is beginning to lose traction, simply because of its perceived relationship with, in modern days, terrorism, and in historically with the slave trade. So all of a sudden, Judaism looks like a pretty cool religion. It's got nothing at all to do with colonialism, imperialism, and it's got nothing at all to do with the slave trade or with terrorism. And so there are those that believe, and there are signs that they may be right, that in time to come, Judaism will be one of the very major religions in Africa. And you might say, as the literalist that I observe you to be,
Oh man.
that this is based upon a myth. All religions, if you like, are based upon a myth, and all histories are based upon a myth. Myths, national myths, and individual myths. Our lives, every single one of us, we act out the myths of our personal beliefs, which we like to think of as being historical.
Yes.
But if you're a married man and you sit with your wife
Right.
and reflect upon something that happened 10 years ago, I suspect there will not be a complete convergence of ideas. I mean, in other words, you'll have completely different views of what happened. So, history is something to be used and is used by people.
Yes.
Usable history.
I'm going to ask you for 10 more minutes because I know you have to go because of circumstances surrounding your day so far. I have your book, the Hybrid Hate, ladies and gentlemen. Please, this is the new book. I want to delve into the book, but I can't do it because it's going to keep him here forever and he has to go. But please purchase his new book, The Hybrid Hate by Tudor Parfitt. All right. Let me get back to the Black Jews in Africa for a second. On page, page 159. No, I'm sorry, on page 163. I'm going to talk about the Lemba for a few minutes. It says, those Lemba with whom I have discussed the results often recall the fact that they habitually refer to themselves as the white men who came from Senia, and that the DNA evidence proves that they were once white and that they are Jews. Can you elaborate on that? Because you have, again, a lot of people claiming the identity and attach themselves, but these folks in Lemba, which I've never spoken to any Lemba, you have done the field research and everything. Can you elaborate on that quote you have in the Black Jews in Africa and the Americas?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly traditionally referred to themselves in that way. They were black and they were living among black people, black tribes in Zimbabwe and northeastern South Africa, and also in places, although I never met them in Mozambique myself, but I understand that there are some in Mozambique. I did meet some in Malawi, which is the country just to the north of Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And the Sena, when we were doing this, when I was doing my kind of field work, my anthropological field work, nobody knew where it was, and it may be that I discovered it in the Yemen. It's a possibility, and the evidence is quite strong, without being 100% strong, I would say. And part of the evidence, well, I'll tell you. So the legend of the Lemba, this maybe by now 100,000 strong people living in Central Africa, with claims to being of Jewish origin, and which in pre-colonial times certainly seemed to have a religion which was very close to Judaism as far as one can judge. I'm giving you the absolute truth as I understand it in these statements. So they have this idea of being of Jewish origin. I met them in 1985 for the first time. I'd just written a book about the Ethiopian Jews and their rescue by Israel in the Operation Moses. I went to South Africa. I met some of these Lemba, and they told me their story, and they said, yes, we know that we came from Sena, we crossed Pusela, we came to Africa, we rebuilt Sena, and then we moved inland and we became dispersed among the nations. That was their theory of origin, their legend of origin, in short. So I decided to write a book about this, and so the way I was going to write the book was to go on a journey to try and solve the question of where Sena was, and were they Jewish? That was the idea of my journey. It was the idea of the book that was written as a journey. And I didn't succeed in either of those objectives in the first version of the book. It was nonetheless an interesting book, and I'm proud of the book. It really was. It was worth doing, and I enjoyed doing it, and I think it was quite a good book. So a little bit later, like a couple of years later, I was in the Yemen. I told the story of this book to a muhtar, to a Muslim holy man. And he said, if you go to the end of the Wadi Hadramaut, which is, by the way, mentioned in the Bible, you will find a place called Senna. And we do have a tradition that people left from there to go to Africa when a great dam burst 1,000 years ago. And so I went there in my Land Rover and discovered this ruined place where some people were still living. And I also discovered that the tribal names of the people living there at that time were the same as the tribal names of the Lemba in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Now, I thought that was a pretty good piece of proof. I discovered a Senna. There was a legend of people leaving to go to Africa. The tribal names were the same. And conscious of the fact that this was fairly circumstantial, I decided to do DNA testing, which tested the population of the Hadramaut against the population of the Lemba in Central Africa. But as well as that, there were test populations that we collected, both in the Yemen and also in different parts of Africa, including Mozambique and different parts of South Africa. So we had a very big collect of DNA, and the resulting work was pretty impressive in terms of demonstrating that, at least on the male side, the Lemba originated out of Africa and in the Middle East. There was another aspect to this, which had to do with something which I'm sure you're familiar with, called the Cohen modal haplotype. And so a year before all of this was happening, we did a very interesting piece of research that was based upon the closeness in the way that it worked of, on the one side, the Jewish priesthood and how you become a Jewish priest, which is by inheriting that status from your father and grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on throughout history. And that's the only way that you can be a Jewish priest, is to be born one from a priestly father. And the Y chromosome, which similarly you get from your father, and he gets it from his father, and he gets it from his father, and so on throughout history. It doesn't change over history any more than the status to priest changes throughout history. So we put these two things together in our research project, and we discovered that a good proportion of the Lemba had this haplotype, and the priestly clan of Buba had it in much the same way as the wider Jewish population. So the first person to do this was actually somebody called Jenkins. He's like me, a Welshman, Welsh Christian. And he was doing his work unbeknownst to me as I was in the Yemen finding Senna. So he published the first thing, which kind of broadly made the same conclusions as we subsequently did, namely a Semitic origin for the Lemba. We kind of expanded this in the sense that we actually found a Middle Eastern population to which it could be appropriately compared. And we added the element of the newly discovered priestly haplotype. In subsequent work, one of his PhD students took the same data and argued that the Cohen modal haplotype, this constellation of genetic material, totally unimportant material, by the way. It's got nothing to do with anything other than the fact that it's saying, where in the world you originate from. And she expanded it to a slightly greater degree, which would have involved more people, but it didn't really particularly undermine the original conclusions that were made in the paper in Nature in 1999. And I think most people to this day would regard that as being fairly robust. But at the same time, I would say this, and this is something that Brother Garfield, I don't think you know, but you may. You've obviously done your research. And so I'm not sure about this. This is speculative, but it's interesting. So if you look at a map of Africa, and you see where the Lemba are living, and originally they were living in and around where the Great Zimbabwe sort of main site is, more or less bang in the middle of present-day Zimbabwe. So not a million miles away, going west, there was another Lemba phenomenon which existed in the area of today's Republic of Congo. I think it probably went as far north as Gabon and also into the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is that vast part of West Africa. And this was a kind of, it was something like a secret society. It was a society of healing. The people concerned were doctors, medicine men, and the symbol of their activities, this Lemba activity, was a drum of healing. Now, to non-Africans, this isn't making much sense, but if you're steeped in African history, African traditions, the weight of the idea of the drum is considerable. And the drum of the Lemba, at the same time, is hugely important. It's called ngoma. And, you know, in the book I wrote about the ngoma, and some of you may have seen the History Channel movie I did, I have connected the story of the Lemba drum with the idea of the Lost Ark of the Covenant. It would be easy to mock this and to say, hey, you think you found the lost tribe of the Lost Ark of the Covenant? Absolutely not. But I never said that. All I said was that the idea of the Lost Ark, the Lost Ark, the Ark of the Covenant, somehow entered Africa, and it seems to be represented in the tribal legends, realities, the tribal history of the Lemba. So what you have is you've got a receptacle made of wood, and if you know your Bible, you'll know that there are two descriptions of the Ark of the Covenant. One is that it was certainly made of wood but covered in gold, and it was quite an elaborate thing, and it had a lid on the top, and there were sort of angels at each end of the top, not really angels exactly, but figures anyway. And that was the, so to speak, the footstool of God. So, and this object was made by Bezalel, the great craftsman. But in the book of Deuteronomy, you will see that Moses himself made an ark, and this was simply made from the acacia trees that were growing on Mount Sinai. And he made this kind of box, and ark just means box, that's all it is, and or chest. And he made it, and the broken tablets were put in it, and he took it down, and subsequently, according to Jewish commentators, there were two arcs. One, the simple wooden thing, was the Ark of War, and the more elaborate thing was the ark that eventually went into the Holy of Holies, the Devir in the Temple in Jerusalem. So the simple wooden object, the Ark of War, let us hypothesize, according to the book of Jeremiah, was taken to a particular cave. There are Muslim accounts of tribes getting hold of this ark, going down into the Yemen, where our Lemba people may be from, seem to be from. And so that would give a kind of historical connection. And when you think that the Lemba priests carried the this relatively rare genetic signature, connecting them perhaps with the priests of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, carrying something which looks very much like the Ark of the Covenant, which is to say it's carried on poles. There are rings on each corner of this object, which I found back in 2006 or 7, and which has got sacred objects inside it, which is carried into war, which can kill people with its flames. And you can go on and on and on. The parallels between the two objects are absolutely overpowering. I'm not in any way saying that that the object I found was the original Ark of the Covenant, but I would say that it was the great grandson.
Okay. Actually, I was reading an article by a brother from who you're probably familiar with. He actually is in opposition to what you're saying, Mr. Rob Barrett. I think that's his name. I'm not sure. And he basically thinks that the ark is something more likely indigenous, or he actually is in opposition to what you're saying. But you're just giving out a hypothetical. You're not saying it's facts. So we're not going to take everything that you're saying literal. What you're just saying. So I just wanted to say that for the audience before anybody takes what you're saying and run with it and make 10 videos. Dr. Parfitt says they found the Ark of the Covenant. All right. Let me ask you this about the Cohen model type. Is it connected to the J haplogroup? This is a basic question just for the audience. I know the answer, but I just want the audience to hear you say it.
Yes, there is a connection. Of course, there's no point you or me really having this conversation because I'm not a geneticist, and nor are you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right.
However, the many geneticists who've worked using this genetic material, and by now there are countless papers, and I think I've contributed to 3 or 4 of them. But let me just tell you what my contribution is. I'm a historian and a linguist. So what I do, I come up with an idea. And so in the case of the Lemba, the idea is, what is the hypothesis? The hypothesis, they may be of Jewish origin.
Mm-hmm.
So you go to the geneticist, say, okay, that's interesting. So we can look at the DNA of Jews, and we can compare it with the DNA of the Lemba, and fine. So that's the hypothesis. And so the next thing is to collect the DNA. Now, collecting DNA is not very. In the United States, it's dead easy. You just send everybody an envelope, and they do something, and they send it back. Bingo, you've got it. Mm-hmm. If you're in Central Africa, it's not the same thing.
Right.
Particularly 20 years ago, when people weren't familiar with with these techniques. So that was my role. It was collecting DNA all over the world for different kinds of projects, and coming up with a hypothesis, and then helping the geneticists who know what they're talking about, and they've spent 20 years learning this stuff. Mm-hmm. Together you can kind of form ideas, and so you're looking at the stuff, as it's coming out of their computers. You say, yeah, okay, well, that's interesting. That would suggest so and so and so and so. I'll give you another example. So you know something about the Jewish diaspora. One of the kind of outliers is the Yemenite Jewish community,
Right.
and partly because they are dark-colored, black in many cases, and most Jews are whitish, I suppose. And the other thing is that they kind of, there's a big gap in their history. So, before about the 9th century, we don't really know much about these guys.
Right.
What we do know, however, is that in the 3rd century, there's a Jewish kingdom just opposite Ethiopia, in Himyar, which was a powerful state in the south of Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
And the king Dhul Nawas converted to Judaism, and then he subsequently, the aristocrats of the kingdom of Himyar converted as well.
Yes,
and so that, for quite a long time, we've got plenty of evidence, both in Israel in terms of tombstones and sarcophagi, and also there in the Yemen. Of course, at the moment, it's a bit difficult to get there to look at it. But anyway, in general, that there was a Jewish kingdom in Himyar.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, so we also know that some Jews from Judea probably arrived there as a kind of military contingent at one point in history. Okay, so we're now looking at the DNA of Yemeni Jews who live up in the mountains, more or less where Himyar is, a little bit to the northeast, because
Right.
most of it was kind of southwest. But anyway, sort of next door. And what we find is that there's a lot of connection with other Jews, and there's also a lot of connection with Yemenites, with Bedouin,
Right.
who live in the area of Himyar. And so they're saying, okay, well, I mean, we don't understand this. There's a connection with these guys, these Bedouin, and there's a connection with other Jews in different parts of the Middle East. How do you explain it? Well, the explanation is very straightforward. The explanation is that 2,000 years ago, you had Himyarites who intermarried with Jews, probably Jews that, if you know your Quran, you know the wars between the Prophet Muhammad and his Muslim followers and the Jews who lived in the oases of the Hijaz.
Right.
Many of them were killed, destroyed, and some of them, no doubt, fled south. So that would be the origin of the community, which becomes historically visible in about the 7th or 8th century. So,
wow, that's. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I have a few little questions regarding: is the CMH, the Cohen model haplotype, is it common among West Africans? And would it be fair to say the reason finding the Cohen model haplotype among some Lemba stands out is precisely because it is not common among African populations in general?
It's not common among African populations in general, as far as I know, with the exclusion, of course, of North African populations, sort of southern Mediterranean populations, where it's likely to be found. But, we're going into an area here that I really don't know anything about. And because I haven't looked recently at new DNA evidence coming out of West African societies, but to my knowledge, it's a relatively rare thing. The places in the world where it's to be found, outside of priestly families, eastern part of Italy, the eastern part of Cyprus, and a certain amount in populations like the Druze in southern Lebanon. In other words, the majority of it is exactly in the area where historical Jewish populations live, and that would be true also of eastern Italy. But it's not to be found, for instance, in you don't find it in Japan or China or most places in the world. West Africa, basically, I don't know.
Okay. This is a question from someone is asking. I'm not going to say the names of the people that he said in the email. I'm not going to do that. That's not appropriate. But I'll say this. Folks in the community, African American community, are claiming Ashkenazi Jews and other white Jews are fake and identity robbers. Does Professor Parfitt see this claim as historically valid and appropriate?
No, I mean, that's a very straightforward one as far as I'm concerned. I think that the evidence associating both Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, well, there's no real difference, to be honest, between Sephardi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. They were the same thing until fairly recently. I mean, the 15th century, and their association with the land of Israel and with the history of the Jewish, with the history of the Jews is clear and overwhelming. It cannot be really undone. It's like saying that President Trump won the election, right? So
I like that.
So it's about that degree of mendacity. Well, I wouldn't use the word mendacity. Again, it's a complicated matter, and I know that I'm going to be putting my foot in it here, and I'm likely to upset people. But I think the idea is essentially a kind of metaphorical association with the people of Israel. But this shouldn't be done in such a way that it's going to destroy or invalidate or devalue other people's religious experience. I think we have to be respectful of each other, and we have to be respectful of each other's traditions, histories, myths. And if people want to believe that, one has to be, it's part of a wider kind of religious and ethnic and identity. And God knows the experience of African Americans has been, people like yourself, has been very painful. It's a very painful history. And painful histories sometimes can only really be resolved through painful means, and this is in a way one of them.
Right.
And it's got to do with race in this particular case. I think, I don't know whether you want this kind of intellectualization on my part, but the way I see it is that if you're a slave living in America before the Civil War, or indeed in the period afterwards during Reconstruction and Jim Crow, it was bloody awful, if I may use my British term. It was bloody awful. And there was no way of extracting yourself from the racial slur of being black, right? And it's only now really beginning to be possible, I would say. So let me just give you a little, then I'm really going to have to go, but I think it's important that maybe some of your guys won't know about this. Some of them will, but the idea of race is not obvious And for most of human history, nobody thought of it as an idea. It wasn't something that was self-evident to people until the end of the 17th century. That's the beginning of the racial age, when somebody came up with a bright and wrong idea that the world could best be divided into groups, which he called races. And he came up with 7. The guy's name was Francois Bernier. He was a French physician. Very, very important book. It started the racial age. According to me, we're now getting towards the end of the racial age. I hope that President Biden will expedite the end of the racial age. We should all stop using the word race, because race does not exist. It is not a thing. There is no biological basis to race at all. Zero, zilch, nada. It's not a thing. And why we have to carry on pretending that it is a thing and that there are biological differences between people is inexplicable to me. I'll give you an example of how it can go horribly, horribly wrong. So, COVID, the papers are full of the fact that African Americans are suffering from COVID more than others, which may very well be true, but it's not because African Americans are black or African Americans are African Americans. It's because perhaps African Americans are poorer and African Americans live in more crowded facilities. And the result, that is no doubt the result of racism, the fact that African Americans are poorer and more crowded than other people. That is the result of racism. I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist, it surely does exist. What I'm saying is that race does not exist. And so a consequence of this, I was speaking to a friend of mine who goes to a black church in Detroit, and she went to her Baptist church, I think it is, the other day, and the pastor said, don't take the vaccine because it won't work on you, black people. Well, you know, this is very, very unhelpful as a message to be giving out to people. And similarly, the United States government said recently that they don't want to use the Oxford vaccine on the grounds that they couldn't be sure it's going to work on black people. I mean, what kind of bizarre, wow, you know, mind-boggling nonsense is this? And it all really comes out of the idea that people in America, but not so much in Europe, still believe that races exist. You can't fill out a form in the United States without having to put race. And when I have to put race, I think, what are you talking about? What am I supposed to put? It's nothing. There's no such thing as race. What do you want from me? You're crazy, you people. So, you know, it's... So, okay, so let's just go back to your question, because I know what you're saying. So if you're black here, and, you know, and particularly earlier on in the history of this country, and you're assumed for wrong reasons of raceology, if you want to call it that, you're assumed to be inferior. You're assumed to have a different response to disease than white people. You are assumed to be more stupid than white people, to be more puny than white people, to be all kinds of things less than white people, until it's useful for white people, in which case you might be considered to be stronger and tougher and more resistant to diseases, right? So, I mean, this is racialization. And so a way out of being considered to be part of this low racial group in the eyes of the whites was to put yourself into another kind of racial group, and so Judaism, you become a Jew, and it works to some extent.
Oh man, hey, I want to say I'm going to end the show now, and then I'm going to talk to you off the air for like 2 minutes, and I want to say it took a lot out of you, to do what you did today. A lot of people don't know your situation, but I want to say thank you from the conscious community. This is actually we're gonna probably put it on a different channel so we can get a lot of viewers. Your book is Hybrid Hate. The Amazon link is in the chat. I'm gonna promote it. I was gonna go into a couple of questions about the book, but I would urge everybody, there's a chapter that deals with the term Black and Negro being used in Europe and so forth. Is very important. I was gonna ask you about that, but we gotta just do it another time. Now is not the time to to keep you on the air. It's good to keep your mind off something, but I mean, let's end it now, and then we'll just arrange to do something else. All right. So, yes, sir.
I've enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for having me on your show.
All right. Give me a second, Dr. Parfitt. Peace and love, family. And I'm gonna talk to Dr. Parfitt off the air. Thank you for joining, and share the show, and remember to get the book Hybrid Hate. Thank you very much. Peace.